In our next video, we will take a look at access policies and some of the settings that we can enable within those. An access policy, this is going to be the most important component of the WSA because this is exactly what we will use to control the transactions, inspect transactions that will be traversing through our proxy. An access policy can be thought of as an equivalent of access control policy on the Firepower Threat Defense, which means that this is going to be a single place, a single control room, which is going to allow us to activate or deactivate certain inspection engines. And now the communication that is going to be inspected by the access policies, because there is going to be more than one access policy what you can define at the WSA, the communication that will be going through the unit, this is going to be clear text HTTP and FTP traffic. But now the key thing here is that if you enable decryption, which is going to be a topic that I will discuss in another session, it will also include the decrypted HTTPS, because decrypted HTTPS is essentially plain text HTTP. So decrypted traffic is also going to be subject to access policies, but we will get back to this topic in a different video. Now, in addition to that, if the decryption for HTTPS is disabled, meaning that you disabled HTTPS proxy, this policy is also going to affect HTTPS communication. Of course, this is all assuming that our proxy is configured on the right ports, on the ports that we will use for the data traffic. And by default, just to recap, it is going to be port numbers 80 and 3128, I think is going to be the other one. Yeah, 80 and 3128. So this is what's going to be by default subject to the access policies, to the inspection. Now, as I said, the main role of access policy is going to be to give us that option of controlling communication, controlling transactions, and this is going to be generally performed by using multiple engines or just sub-engines of the WSA, ranging from URL filtering through application visibility and control, through malware scans, data, security policies, and a few more. So we have different engines for different elements that might be subject to the inspection. Like if I want to control communication based on URLs, like inspecting the client requests, for example, to block social networking, I'm going to choose the URL filtering engine. Like if I want to block just part of the Facebook communication, I'm going to use ABC. If I want to use advanced malware protection or local antivirus engines, I will be using malware scanning engine. Okay, moving on. In order to properly configure access policies, you have to know how WSA processes those. So we can have multiple access policies, and each of those policies will be placed into the so-called access policy table. And this table is going to be evaluated like identification profile table, which is top-down, until we have a match. When we have a match, we stop evaluation, we leave the table, we stop processing, and we take actions defined within the policy that we matched. Now, every single policy can be defined using more than one condition type. We can go for identification profiles. This is going to be the most commonly used condition, but we can also select a protocol, port number, maybe narrow down the client subnets, the IP address ranges the policy will affect, and there's going to be also some other options like time-based control. We will take a look at them in just a second. Of course, there is also going to be that global policy, which is going to act as a catch-all. This is an equivalent of access lists implicit deny. Now, in case of the WSA, this policy doesn't actually block communication, and most of its settings will be set to the monitor action. And there is actually also another application of the global policy, rather than just acting as a catch-all. This one is also used to populate your custom policies as you build them. Maybe let's take a look at that on the WSA. Just to recap from the previous session, we've got a single identification profile defined, which is catching all transactions from the subnet. Now, so we go to the access policy table, web security manager, access policies, and there should be the global policy, which is, again, as I said, configured with the monitor action. Yeah, it's over here. And note that this policy applies to any identification profile. So it's like a match-all for all identification profiles that you have defined. Because remember, it's going to be the identification profile what is evaluated first for a transaction that is to be eventually processed by the WSA. So I can have multiple identification profiles, and in order for the global policy to be enforced, it must account for all of those profiles. So most of those so-called control settings, because those individual engines, inspection engines, are known as control settings in the WSA's terminology, they are configured with the monitor action. And I will explain what that means in this session. Now, the other important thing about this policy, as I said, is going to be its effect on the custom policies that you build. Because in most cases, you will want to use your own policies for individual departments or just portions of the network. And in our case, we will actually build one policy that is going to be specifically configured for this segment. So for our client segment, this device is going to act as our client. So I will say within the policy config, I'm going to give it a name like LAN policy. I'm going to say that the identification profile I want to correlate it with is going to be our custom profile, which doesn't require an authentication. And that's going to be actually the only condition I'm going to use to build this policy. I could change the proxy ports, maybe narrow down the subnet I put in my profile, identification profile. I could come up with time-based control, like if I were to define time ranges. So you'd have to first define at least one time range, which is, it should be somewhere here. Define time ranges and quotas. This is where you can define a time range. Once you do this, you would be able to choose it here from this section. Like if you want to apply this policy within a certain time. Okay, I could also go for URL categories and user agents. But in our case, it's going to be just one condition, profile. So notice what is going to happen when we finally add this policy. What we should see here is that all of the control settings are populated. Their configuration is populated, is the same as what we defined in the global policy. It actually mentions global policy, global policy, global policy. So what that means is that our LAN policy at that point is essentially doing the same thing here as the global policy. The only difference is that policy number 1 applies to transactions classified as part of LAN client's identification profile. Okay, I'm gonna push this change because we will now look at individual, most of those control settings one by one. And I will explain what they mean and how to configure them. Let me just push this change. Right, so very important thing, remember that normally if this was production, first thing you would probably want to do would be to tune the global policy. This would be your first step. And then in the second step, you would add your custom policies. And this is obviously all about simplifying the overall config. Like when you do the tuning properly in the first step, you'll have less configuration to do for individual policies. Individual control settings within access policies can be configured with different actions. But there are going to be some actions that will be kind of like shared between those settings. And WSA actions can be in general broken down into two sections, into two groups, I should say. We've got what is known as an intermediary action, where there is just one intermediary action, monitor. And we have what is known as final actions. And there's going to be more than one final action what you can configure. Or the difference is going to be in the packet processing, in the transaction processing, I should say. Like with the intermediary action, which is again just the monitor action, this action is generally configured to log the traffic, but it still allows other control settings or other policies within given control settings to be processed. So it doesn't stop packet processing, transaction processing. So it's like the WSA says, okay, I've got a match here in this control setting with this role or just within that policy. The policy is configured with the monitor action. So I'm going to log the transaction, but I don't really know at this point what to do with the transaction. I don't know if it's good or bad, if I should allow it or not. So I'm going to hand it over to a different control setting, to a different engine, or just continue with evaluation of other policies so that those components can make a final decision. And now a final action is when you will say that you want to allow the transaction, or you want to block it, or maybe you want to perform redirection. There are also a few more final actions that you can select. They eventually depend on the control setting we are using for the session. But the key thing here is that once you say you want to allow, block, or redirect, or something else which is final, the packet processing is going to stop. So you will not be using other engines. You will not be inspecting transaction any further. Right, so based on what I just showed you, you probably figured out that there is going to be some sort of order of operation, how the different control settings will be applied to the transactions. And this is actually showing us the actual order. So transactions are generally broken down into clear text or encrypted sessions, where the main difference between how HTTP versus HTTPS is processed is going to be all about the decryption for HTTPS, which could potentially take place. And if it takes place, there is also going to be that encryption at the end, so we can send the packet after evaluating it to the network in its original form. Everything else, I mean, the order of features, the order of control settings is going to be the same for both types of connections, with the exception of this setting, and also with the exception of where the custom URLs are processed. Like we have custom URLs over here for HTTPS versus for HTTP, we will evaluate custom URLs within access policy. Okay, but as you can see, everything else is going to be evaluated in pretty much the same order for those two types of transactions, clear text versus encrypted. So we're going to start with a so-called bypass list, which is how you can exclude communication from the proxy processing. This is something that you can configure under Web Security Manager bypass settings. It is possible to define traffic characteristics that will cause certain communication to bypass the WSA. Like WSA is going to get the transaction, is going to get the packet, but it will not do anything with it. You can specify, it will actually show us the right syntax, the full syntax here. It says it could be an IP address, it could be CIDR block, a domain, or a host name. So you can be very selective with what packets will bypass every single inspection engine of the WSA, including identification profiles and access policies. Okay, in the second step, we will perform evaluation of the identification profiles. Then there is going to be what is known as a web-based reputation system, or just web-based reputation score. We will talk about most of those engines in this session. We can then perform authentication, and this is what is generally performed globally. So this portion is global settings. Now this portion here is going to be our access, and not access control, access policies. So when we found our identification profile, we already have a profile. We did some other inspections in the meantime. We enforce authentication or disable authentication. In case of HTTP, we're going to start evaluating the transaction characteristics in terms of the protocol, port number, and then the user agent. Or user agent is just an identifier of the application which is carried inside of HTTP request. Okay, next we will perform URL filtering with custom or predefined categories. Now, in case of HTTPS, we will first try to decrypt the packet. And now, assuming that the packet, the flow is decrypted, we will also enforce our policy with URL categories. Next, there is going to be that application visibility and control engine. We can then perform filtering with object types, or maybe use the MIME field to block certain files. So this is going to be an equivalent of file policies. And finally, we've got our antivirus/malware scans. Right, so the key takeaway here is that the bypass list, when you say you want to bypass, it means that you don't want to use WSA, you don't want to enforce the policy. Right, so this is the order of how do we process client transactions, the requests. There is going to be a change in what we will use to process replies, so HTTP response messages coming from the server. In this case, the focus is going to be on the content. As a first check, we will look at the file size. We can block files that are large. And next, we will use ABC. So look into the application level. Then we will perform a web reputation, a scoring. We will calculate a WBRS score, and finally perform malware scans. So we have less engines to use in this case because most of the transaction was evaluated at the request level. Okay, so let's now take a look at some of those engines, some of those control settings. And maybe let's start with URL filtering, which is a method of controlling web communication based on the URL from the request. And this is what is supported for web usage controls. So for this to use it, you want to make sure that the feature is enabled. Now let's take a look at, it's going to be under acceptable use controls, where you want to check if this is enabled. So we need this engine to be turned on. You need to have it turned on to use this feature. And this is also what's going to be needed for application visibility and control. Okay, so this is what you can enable, disable here in the global settings. Now, URL filtering is going to be generally performed using those predefined categories that you downloaded from Cisco. So instead of enforcing our policy on individual URLs, we will be configuring it on URL groups, on those categories, like to block Facebook, Twitter, and some other social websites. You will just block a single category, the social network category. Now, as with FTD, some of the URLs will never be categorized, like when the website is new or maybe URL changes. So Cisco is not able to classify those websites in the real time. And this is where the WSA's dynamic content analysis is going to come into play if you enabled it. It allows you to perform classification for a transaction in real time based on some sort of proprietary algorithms. So it's like the WSA is trying to figure out what category a given transaction should be associated with. It's like a local scanning engine for those URLs. Of course, we can also use custom URLs, but those are generally used to make exceptions. Like when you have some specific websites that are classified as one or another category, maybe category-based policy says you want to block, but for those few URLs you want to allow. So you would build a custom URL, you would go to the custom URL categories here under Web Security Manager, you would add an entry, and then you would be able to use it in the policy. Okay, so I could click over here. I would give it a name like my www, and then I could specify sites using this notation. So IP addresses, CIDR blocks, domains, or partial host names, or even a FQDN. And I could also use the regular expression section to specify those URLs. So it even gives you some clue about the regular expression syntax supported by the WSA. And going back to the policy, and maybe let me also open protocols and user agents. And I'm going to open a separate window, separate tab for other control settings. And we will also take a look at protocols and user agents, this one. Okay, so we are filtering, we've got those different categories over here, like alcohol, like adult, like advertisements, like social networking, professional networking, so this would be for LinkedIn. We've got those different categories here. I can block, I can monitor, I can generate a warning, I can block based on time, like if my time ranges were configured. And I can also enforce my policy based on predefined quotas. Okay, there is also an option that says, what do you want to do with URLs that were not categorized? So I can block, monitor, or maybe generate a warning. And you also have an option to tell what to do when the categories are kind of like changed, like when some of them are merged. You can also use the question mark. It is going to explain you what the option actually does. We also have settings for safe search and site content rating. Like if you want to use WSA to enforce safe search, which is just a modification done on the HTTP request, on the client HTTP request, to tell the search engine to return less content than it would normally do, to cut down on non-safe content. So some tuning might be needed in this for those global settings, but to enforce the policy, you will be using the categories here. Now, for some of the control settings, to change those options, you will actually have to say you want to add it global. You want to change from global settings and add it the policy. In this case, the way that we will enforce the policy is going to be by selecting those options here. And I'm going to say that we will block social networking. Okay, this I want to fall back to the global settings. So I want to say block social networking. We will submit this. But now before I push the policy, let me show you that connection to Facebook is going to be allowed. Now facebook.com, this is emulated by router 4. And this device is acting as Facebook website and also as CNN.com. where test server is accessible via www.test.com. So we will use these two devices to test our policies. Okay, we see I can get to Facebook. Maybe let's also connect to the WSA and take a look at this in the log messages. So we see a transaction here for Facebook, and it is allowed. It says there was no entry in the cache. So we took the content directly from the server, and notice that the transaction was classified as part of the LAN client identification profile, where our policy enforced on the session is this LAN policy. So we have a match in the identification profiles, and we have a match with our access policy, which is good. Now, if I were to push those changes, so I want to block social networking, what we should see here is that communication to Facebook is going to be blocked, but we would be able to get to other websites, like, for example, CNN.com. Okay, so we see that the change is in place. We can now try to confirm that. We see that the message is displayed that says Facebook.com is blocked because of the URL filtering category social networking, which is blocked. CNN.com is part of a different category. It is part of news. So we should be able to get to this URL. In the meantime, I'm going to also show you a change in the log message. It's here. It says blocked due to web category. And this is the access policy that was a match. TCP denied. And then CNN.com, this one should work. I'll just give it some time. And we see we have connectivity. Okay, so pretty simple configuration for URL-based filtering. One other thing I promised to show you was the protocols and user agents before we move on with other engines. If you want to change the settings here, you want to click on Define Custom Settings, because by default it is going to rely on the global policy. This is what you can use to block individual protocols, like all HTTP, all encrypted HTTP, and this is also where you can tell it that you want to block a certain ports when the HTTP connect method is used, like when someone is trying to tunnel over HTTP. You can also use this section to block custom user agents and individual agents. The syntax for them can be found here. For instance, if I wanted to block Firefox, I would just copy this portion, put it over here, submit, push the policy, and Firefox transactions would be always blocked, all of them. So this is like you want to restrict your users to using one, maybe two different browser types. Right, but I will not be doing this. We will move on and we will now talk about application visibility and control, which is how you enable deep inspection at the application layer. So what they mean by saying deep inspection at layer 7. It's all about allowing WSA to distinguish between micro applications that are carried within the main application or just a session that traverses via the proxy. So an example is going to be when you go to Facebook.com, where, as you know, you can post messages, you can upload photos, you can play games. With AVC, you will be able to control those micro applications selectively. I can block games, but I'm going to allow for photo uploads. By the way, blocking is just one example. You can also configure bandwidth limits. So maybe I don't want to block gaming. I just want to limit the amount of bandwidth that gaming is allowed to use in my network. This is something that you will also enable under security services acceptable use controls. Same place as what we use to enable URL filtering. We take a look at the Applications tab. This is AVC. Let's take a look at some of the options. And maybe I'm also gonna open the objects in the same time. So again, if you wanna change the default global settings, you wanna click over here. I can specify the application I wanna look at. This stuff is generally supposed to be kept up to date, so we have more options available. Let's try to find Facebook. Expand Facebook. So not all applications support bandwidth limiting, but some of them do. If we take a look at Facebook, we see we've got the entertainment, micro application, games, sports, utilities, events, general, messages and chat, photos, videos. So I can change the default action, which is to monitor. I can block, or I can specify a bandwidth limit. For bandwidth limit, actually, you will first thing have to define it for the application itself, for the main application. Like set the limit to this amount of megs or kilobits per second, apply, and then you will be able to choose it for individual micro applications. Okay, I also opened up objects just to show you what this one is gonna do. The concept is just to block transactions based on the type of files, actually block files, I should say, based on their type. Like for example, if I want to block PDFs, I would check this option. If I want to block MS Office documents, I would use this checkbox. I can also specify custom MIME types. Just put them over here, submit, push the policy. I can also define a size for my object, so how large a file can be, so I can download it. This is for HTTP response, a portion of the session. And finally, the last element that I want to take a look at is going to be related, in case of access policy, to the anti-malware and reputation settings. This is known as WBRS, Web Reputation System, which concept is used to associate a numerical value in the range between -10 to +10. This is an integer, which represents how trusted or not trusted a given URL is. So WBRS works based on a lot of different elements to determine the reputation score. It's the history of the URL, it's the age of the website, the history of malware, location of the website, and a lot of other elements that Cisco takes into account when making the WBRS calculation. You will have access to those numbers when you enable the feature. And now the reason that WSA fetches the information about the score, about WBRS numbers, is to use it as an input to 3 of its types of policies: access, decryption, and data security. So access policies, we are looking at this stuff now. We know that this is used to control the transactions. Decryption policies is what we will use to decrypt HTTPS communication. Where data security policies, this is what you will use to control uploads. So from the clients, somewhere outbound, like what type of files you want to allow to be uploaded, what files you want to block, stuff like that. From the clients to the servers. And now specifically in case of access policy, the number that WBRS provides is used to determine whether we want to scan the transaction with our scanning engines. Let's say I want to add it. So I can use my local scanning engines, antivirus systems, WebRoot, Sophos. I can specify what type of categories I want to look at. I can also say that when I detect a problem, I want to block. I can also use it for advanced malware protection. Plus, the number itself is also used to determine if a transaction should be blocked without actually scanning it, or maybe I want to allow the transaction without scanning it. So we can also use this tool to block some communication, or maybe allow the communication without involving the scanning engines. And now, which of those three actions you will actually perform is going to depend on the number returned by this engine to the WSA. Like if it's going to be something in this range from -10 to -6, I'm going to block. From +6 to 10, I'm going to immediately allow. Versus if it is somewhere here, I'm going to say that I want to scan the transaction. Now this action allow here, it means that you want to allow without scanning. Versus block is also to immediately block the session. So this number is definitely important for the access policy. Now in case of the decryption policy, the concept is going to be similar, but the goal here is going to be to figure out if the session is to be decrypted or not. Because if it is not, I'm going to immediately drop the packets. If the reputation of the URL of the website is really bad, I will drop encrypted communication. Or if the reputation is really good, I'm going to allow encrypted traffic through. And finally, for my data policy, once again, one that we use for uploads, it is only used to block uploads to websites that are really bad. From -10 to -6, it's a really bad reputation. With a score like that, we will immediately block upload. We will not continue with further evaluation. Right, so the key takeaway from this session is going to be to remember how the policies are processed. It's going to be top-down until a match is found, with a global policy acting as a catch-all. Plus, don't forget that the global policy is also acting as a source of default settings for your custom policies. And now once we have a match with a custom policy, like in our case, for this identification profile, the settings that will be applied for the policy are going to be generally processed from the left to the right. So we will start with the protocols and user agents. We will do the filtering, ABC, file policies, and finally anti-malware, antivirus scans.